Today, we're taking another historic step to deepen and formalize cooperation among all three of our nations.
Well, good morning from Washington and good afternoon to you in Beirut. This is the start to day 2 of the Carnegie Middle East Center's conference on navigating a turbulent future, what to expect in 2022. I am Nilanthi Samaranayaka, Director of CNA's Strategy and Policy Program. I'm delighted to be joined by 3 insightful speakers as we delve into our topic today, maritime insecurity around the Arabian Peninsula. The speakers are Dr. Abdullah Babood, Darshan Abaroa, and Paul Hanley. And one note, Dr. Rudra had to withdraw from our panel and extends his regrets. Each speaker will take up to 10 minutes to discuss their views on security in Middle East waters. And then we'll discuss as a group and reflect on regional rivalries, as well as the role of great power rivalries for the region. And we'll finish with questions from attendees. I'll ask Dr. Abdullah Babood to kick off our discussion. He is chair of the State of Qatar for Islamic Area Studies and visiting professor at Waseda University. He's an academic from Oman and has served in numerous posts overseas as visiting professor, including at the National University of Singapore, at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar, and has also served as director of the Gulf Research Center at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Babood, please begin.
Thank you very much, Nilanthi, for this kind introduction, and thank the colleagues at the Carnegie Institute for their kind invitation. It also gives me a great pleasure to participate with such a distinguished panel here to talk about maritime insecurity in the Arabian Peninsula. It's a very timely topic, and I think it is well chosen because, as you know, this is one of the most important items on the agendas, not only of regional countries, but also of international countries and global powers as well. As you know, maritime transport is a very important part of the whole cluster of economic activities globally, and much of global trade and global wealth is dependent on maritime transportation. It is being mentioned, it's been said that transport over waves, over seawater, accounts for something like 90% of all traded goods. And the oceans provide the arteries for this global trade, and they create opportunities, and of course, they create challenges. This is even expected to grow more as global freight and global trade increases, and maritime trade volumes are set to triple by 2050. Now, when we're talking about the significance of global trade, we have to also take into consideration that the Arabian Peninsula is situated in an area where it actually forms a choke point for this international trade, especially the Strait of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb, and if you want to extend that to the Suez Canal. There is something like $21 billion worth of oil that is traded through the Strait of Hormuz. 70% or so of that goes to the east, to China and eastern countries. So you can see how significant is this Strait of Hormuz. Equally, the Bab el-Mandeb is also important not only for international trade, connecting between east and west, but also it's also important for global energy transactions and trade. Something like 6.2 million barrels a day of crude and condensate passes through the Bab el-Mandeb. One can understand that these choke points are not only important for regional countries, but they are also extremely important for global trade and for economic well-being at the global level. It is, in that sense, no coincidence that maritime security in the waters of the Gulf, Arabian Peninsula, has become very important topic to be discussed not only in this panel, but also it's being discussed globally, and there is a lot of attention to it, and it's on the agenda of many global powers and regional powers. This is because of the rising insecurity, whether it is in the Strait of Hormuz or the Bab el-Mandeb. As you know, the conflict between Iran and the global powers, especially here in the United States, and the maximum pressure policy of the United States has pushed Iran to start to act on its own individually, trying to create tension in the region, with the premise that if you lock us in, you can't expect to have a safe passage. And again, this is a reflection of how international and global policies can affect regional securities. And we've heard, and many of you have heard, about all the different incidents that have happened, from attacks on shipping lines and oil tankers, on clashes between the Iranians and the Americans in one sense or the other. So far it has been controlled, and so far it has not led to major repercussions. But the temptation is there, and the causes are still there. And of course, the effect of that on global trade and energy security is immense, not just for the region, but globally. Equally, it can be said about the Bab el-Mandeb, because of the conflict in Yemen, and now we are seeing and also previously in Somalia, but also we're now seeing conflict in Ethiopia, which could have repercussions. Regional conflicts throw themselves into international arena, and they cannot be just managed from a distance, because we live in a globalized world where each country kind of depends on other countries, and each region depends on other regions as well. And in this very interdependent world, any conflict can have dire repercussions on other regions and other countries. And especially if this region that, like the one we are talking about here today, which is in the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf, as I have mentioned, is one of the most important strategic region in terms of its geostrategic positioning and location, but also in terms of oil security that is important for the well-being of all the international community. Now, all this is happening at a time where there isn't anything that we can talk about that resembles some kind of a regional security structure that can deal with any of these conflicts. Conflicts can sometimes even happen by accidents, can happen by misunderstanding, and by raising tension. And we have witnessed that although there has been no major clash as such, but the temptation and the causes, as I said, are there, and it could happen at any moment, given, of course, that the region or the waters in the Gulf in particular are full of different forces that are operating there. We have heard about the US creating Operational Sentinels, which is an international maritime security construct in 2019. And some European countries followed that, but other European countries did not want to be seen as acting in coalition with the United States against Iran, and they created their own European maritime awareness, which is known as IMASOS in the Strait of Hormuz, and that was in 2020. Now, we've seen that the Gulf states themselves have some kind of cooperation between themselves, but there are, of course, conflicts even between the Gulf states that we're now witnessing that these conflicts are being put aside, and there is some kind of a rapprochement going on. But I think it takes more than just having international powers, global powers, operating in the region, and or the smaller Gulf states trying to take matters into their hand. This area is of importance, of significant importance to the global economy, to the global security of energy, and therefore what is needed is much more an indigenous security structure that focuses, particularly in this area, on maritime security, where issues like operational procedures, rules of engagement, communications, etc., is established to ensure that conflicts doesn't get out of hand and doesn't lead to a major confrontation that could have major repercussions, not only on the region but beyond. I think I have said what I needed to be said. Now I'm happy to take questions later on or intervene later on, and I pass on back to you, Anthony. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baboud. You raised some important points in your presentation about the significance of the choke points in the region and their direct relevance to global trade and the importance of security and stability of those choke points, and to prevent issues such as attacks on oil tankers. I thought those were all very important points. One question I'd like to come back to when we have our group discussion is you mentioned the US-led international maritime security construct and alternate maritime security efforts. Since the focus really of our conference is about what to expect in 2022, I'm curious to get your thoughts on what effect, if any, of those constructs, those efforts by regional and external powers, what effects those may have in the coming year. But first, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Darshan Abaroa. She is an associate fellow with the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington, where she leads the Indian Ocean Initiative. She has served in multiple visiting fellow positions across the Indo-Pacific. That includes at the Japan Institute of International Affairs in Tokyo, also at the Australian National University in Canberra, and she also served as Associate Director of Carnegie India in New Delhi. Darshana, please begin.
Thank you, Nilanthi. Really glad to be doing this panel, and thank you to Carnegie Middle East Center for putting this panel as part of the annual conference. I think the Indian Ocean Initiative at the endowment is very new, and it's an effort to kind of raise some of these issues around that we face in terms of the maritime security and insecurity across the Indo-Pacific. And so really glad to be having this conversation. I think my set of remarks probably will carry on from what Dr. Mahmood said, laid out in his opening comments, and much of it is around the importance of the choke points in how that plays out within the larger strategic calculations for many countries. I think for a long time, and this is an issue across the Indian Ocean region, is that there are mental maps, there are silos that exist within the oceans that are created by governments, and I think that has come into play, especially after the Cold War. But when you think about the region, you essentially end up thinking very much continental, which of course has its own pressing issues, but the maritime side of it somewhere disappears, and the division of the Indian Ocean region over the years have led to kind of having sub-regions work in different silos. So I'll try and attempt to in just about the next 2-3 minutes just lay out how that impacts the wider Indo-Pacific, of course, the Indian Ocean region, and how that would play out for a country like China so far out of the region, or US and others in its implications. As Dr. Babood mentioned, the Strait of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb are two key choke points in the region. There's also the Red Sea and that connects to the Suez Canal, which are all very significant transit routes in and out of the region. The Suez Canal is important for trade going from the Middle East and other parts of Africa and Asia to Europe. And on the other end, you have Straits of Malacca on around Singapore and Malaysia, the route going, basically, essentially the energy routes going into Southeast Asia, to Korea, Japan, and China. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the Strait of Hormuz and the Strait of Malacca are the world's most important strategic choke points, just by the volume of transit, the number of vessels that carry energy at a global scale goes through these two choke points. So one is on the eastern side of the Indian Ocean region, and the other is on the western side of the Indian Ocean region. And they essentially carry goods in and out of the region, whether it's to Europe, Africa, Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia. And I do believe that the next set of competition, geopolitical competition, a lot of insecurity, instability will play out within this theater, which encompasses many key subregions, again, South Asia, the Middle East, the Persian Gulf, the eastern coast of Africa, and again, Nilanthi, you've worked a lot on this on the islands of the Indian Ocean region. Coming to kind of the competition and why this would play out, because it's not that the choke points became important in the last couple of years, or just all of a sudden the transits have become important. The transits, the energy dependency on these choke points have always been important, and as Dr. Babood mentioned, they are likely, the dependency on these routes and trade across these transit routes is likely to increase. But we can expect perhaps more attention around these waters because of rising competition and I think competition for space, for influence around this region. Because say if China comes into the region, and it's not when China is in the region, it of course wants to have partnerships with countries around the Indian Ocean region or across the Indo-Pacific as well, even though Beijing does not use the term. But when it's trying to also position itself, say, as a key security player or as a critical actor in the region, it not only has to protect its own sea lines of communications that transits through the Indian Ocean region and through the Western Pacific, transiting these narrow choke points, but it should also be able to offer that security and protection to any of the other partners that it seeks to have a relationship with. So whether it seeks to have a relationship with African countries, or whether it's the South Asian littorals or the Gulf countries or Sri Lanka and Maldives in terms of the islands, a strategic and a defense partnership would mean that China would have to have the ability to, in terms of conflict, whether it is attacks on tankers or a limited military conflict, protect its own sea lines of communications, which are these energy transit routes, as well as the transit routes for the region as a whole. And that would require a country to have facilities in the region. That would require a country to be more present in the region, have more operations, be able to maintain maintain and sustain that sort of presence. So I do see more engagements, more collaborations toward that can have countries compete. Say if China seeks to have a relationship with a country, I would see India competing with that. I would see Japan competing with that. I would see reactions from France and reactions from the US, of course. Some of that competition has come out already in many forms. We also have, I think it was last year, that Russia announced its new base in Sudan on the coast of the Red Sea, connecting it to Bab el-Mandeb and onwards to Suez Canal. So I think we will see more and more competition and more engagement and interaction around these areas. For a very long time, there was no key competition, or there is no competition around these areas vis-a-vis US or India or other countries that were there in the region. There was an understanding. US, India, and others worked together to a certain degree in the Indian Ocean region. I don't think so there was a direct threat or there was a direct competition from within the different powers who have been in the Indian Ocean region. And I think today that competition comes from China's maritime ambitions, China's maritime goals. And again, I do want to note here that I don't mean to say that what China is doing is wrong, or it's not compatible, or it's not what the region wants. But I think it is the track that any rising power, any country that with maritime ambitions would do, which is to secure your sea lines of communications. Throughout history, it has been during conflicts, during naval wars, protecting the sea lines of communications is the number one priority for a navy of any nation. So if the goal is to be able to be a security provider, to be a security player, to be kind of a global power in the region, the first act would be, a long-term goal would be to make sure that a nation has the power, the capacity, and the capability to protect the sea lines of communications. And it is not just the oil, commercial goods. As we heard, almost 80% of the world's trade is seaborne, and these have to go through these waters and these narrow choke points. And I think for a very long time, because there was no competition around these areas, governments and policies have tend to kind of look at the region in silos through continental views, which again has its own right. But then I think looking at the region through a coherent picture, Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean, Indo-Pacific as a whole, and how the subregions play a role will help us understand how these developments will pan out in the 21st century, when the systems, norms, and the conversations are significantly different from the 1945 world, but also after the Cold War. There are many countries in the region who were still colonies during the Cold War period. So I think it will have a lot more impact today with sovereign nations, sovereign choices, sovereign conversations, and how that would play out between different players in the region. And it's not only China, I would say, who might be a new actor in the region or might be considered a new actor, especially on the maritime side of it. But there are also more and more we can see in terms of engagement from Russia, from Turkey, from Saudi Arabia. And I think it'll be interesting to see and important to study how these interactions between the different players, the new actors, as I think US and others would see it, would have an impact between on U.S. interests and ambitions in the region, the U.S. and its partners, what role India would play, what India can do in the region, or what it seeks to do, and of course within the Indo-Pacific structure. I'm happy to come back to some questions if there are on how India views the region, but I thought I would use my time to really lay out to make really 2 points. One is why this region is important, why we need to look at it in a coherent manner, and to really break down the continental silos of the maritime spaces and look at it as one theater, because that's what really will allow us to understand why these critical subregions would have a wider implications on the Indo-Pacific, which has a far greater geographic expanse.
Thank you, Darshana, for those insightful remarks. It was very interesting for me to hear your remarks after Dr. Babood's. You both emphasized the importance of choke points. It was interesting to hear Dr. Babood. He really emphasized it, I think, from a supply perspective, talking about the importance of choke points and really the significance for global trade. So really thinking out. And I thought your presentation was interesting because you talked about choke points and really the context of energy dependence on the choke points, and then the implications of that dependence, such as manifesting itself through military presence in the region and the need to secure those interests. One question I'd like to come back to you in our group discussion is you mentioned a lot about the competitive elements of the region, certainly of China, possible implications in terms of from Japan, India, the United States. One question I have is, as you're thinking ahead to 2022, are there ways where China will actually cooperate with the United States, with Japan, with India on issues relevant to the Middle East waters? I'll be curious to get your thoughts on that when we come to our discussion portion. But first, let me introduce Paul Hanley to give his remarks. He is director of the Carnegie Center in Beijing. And okay, thank you for coming up there. And Paul, he, interestingly, before coming to Carnegie, he served as director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia affairs on the National Security Council staff for former presidents Barack Obama and George W. Bush. He's also trained as a China Foreign Area Officer in the U.S. Army, and he retired at the lieutenant colonel rank. Paul, please begin your remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Nilanthi, and thanks to Maha and the Carnegie Middle East Center for inviting me to participate. I always look forward each year to the annual conference, and it's no different this year. Only wish I could be there in person, but look forward to doing that in the future. And I appreciate the opening comments by Dr. Babood and Darshana, really setting the context very well for these maritime security issues in the Arabian Peninsula. My research really focuses on U.S.-China, and what I thought I might do in my opening comments is just sort of step back a little bit and start out from a high level to discuss major trends that we're seeing regarding the U.S. and China's role in the Persian Gulf, and then maybe move to address specific issues around the maritime posture of each country. And hopefully this will frame the issues that we will discuss in the discussion in the Q&A period. Over the past decade, the dominant trends that we have seen with respect to the U.S. and Chinese engagement in the Middle East, in terms of the U.S., we've seen U.S. retrenchment and a pivot to the Indo-Pacific. And in terms of China, we're watching the emergence of a global power with interests growing beyond its core periphery in the Asia-Pacific, moving out, including areas around the Middle East and throughout the global South, frankly. And these trends have come to the fore recently in the wake of the United States' withdrawal from Iraq, from Afghanistan. And that, of course, is contrasted by growing Chinese involvement in the Middle East through its Belt and Road Initiative and strategic partners with a number of countries in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Algeria, and Egypt. But I think my own sense is we're in the early stages, I think, of a fundamental reorientation in the region. The U.S. continues to have abiding interests in the Middle East, even as the Biden administration reassesses the effectiveness of leading with the military force to solve the region's challenges. On the other hand, China's engagement in the Persian Gulf is still primarily guided by trade and economic interests, even while its ability to project military power has grown alongside its economic development. But China is relatively new to its role as a global power and has been, I think, engaged in what I would call sort of a process of trial and error, or what the Chinese like to refer to as crossing the river by feeling the stones. And so what I might do is go over some of the U.S. key interests in the region, then discuss China's key interests, and conclude by highlighting areas where these interests converge and where they diverge. First, on the U.S. side, last March, we saw the Biden administration release its interim strategic guidance. And that guidance listed three main priorities for the Middle East. First was a commitment to Israel's security and promoting a two-state solution to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Second was deterring Iran's destabilizing activities in the region while pursuing diplomacy to address the Iranian nuclear program. And third was disrupting terrorist networks and preventing an ISIS resurgence. And while none of these objectives are particularly new, what has changed, I think, is that the Biden administration has stated it doesn't believe that military force is the answer to the region's challenges. Similar to other areas of U.S. foreign policy, the administration is looking to lead with diplomacy and to work multilaterally to solve problems in the region. And finally, of course, the Biden administration has tried placing a much larger focus on human rights, and it's withdrawn U.S. support for offensive military operations in Yemen, and it's backed UN efforts to end that war. Looking at China's growing role in the Persian Gulf, as I suggested earlier, has been a natural outgrowth of its emergence as a leading trade and economic power. China views strong trade and economic ties to the region as important to its own development and security at home. 60% of China's trade is shipped by sea, and the Gulf region supplies nearly 30% of China's oil imports. In addition to trade, China also has interests in establishing strategic partnerships with countries in the region, especially through its Belt and Road Initiative, where it's looking to develop ports, infrastructure, telecommunication projects. But rather than sort of pick sides or get involved in regional disputes, China has shown a preference generally to make as many friends as possible, both big countries, small states, in an effort really to advance its own economic and also its own security interests. We at Carnegie in Beijing, we hold an annual Carnegie Global Dialogue where we discuss China-Middle East issues. And over the past several of these, we have heard from both Chinese and international experts that China tends to pursue a policy of neutrality with respect to regional disputes. One example, China has a strategic partnership with both Iran and with Saudi Arabia, despite, of course, the longstanding tensions between those two countries. And this approach is often described as transactional rather than strategic. From a U.S. perspective, however, some analysts would argue that China's preference for neutrality amounts to a willingness to pursue strong strategic ties with actors that are adversarial to U.S. interest and those of its allies. And examples here, of course, would be Iran and Syria. On the security side, as I mentioned, China's strategic involvement in the region stems largely from its emergence as a major economic power. The Chinese scholars will often refer to the sea route that stretches from the South China Sea in the Western Pacific, in Southeast Asia, to the Indian Ocean, up through the Suez Canal, into the Eastern Mediterranean, as they refer to this as China's maritime lifeline, Haishang Shengming Xian. And I don't think China necessarily has a grand strategy to replace the U.S. Certainly as the primary security guarantor in the region. It does not have an interest in getting sort of sucked into military disputes in the region. Chinese leaders have watched the U.S. face significant costs and risks from exposure there. But China does have an interest in deploying greater numbers of military assets. It has an interest in conducting more naval patrols and developing military facilities, which can be dual-use ports in order to protect its own citizens and its investments in the region. And as China perceives the U.S. to be retrenching from the region and taking a less active role in that traditional security guarantor role, I think China is feeling more pressure to invest more on its own to protect its own personnel and shipping lanes, which are very important for China. It's estimated that China has approximately 1 million citizens overseas in Africa and 500,000 citizens in the Middle East alone. And we recall, of course, that at the height of the civil war in Libya, for example, China was forced to deploy naval assets to evacuate 35,000 citizens from the country. I think that was a big surprise to China. In 2015, China used its Navy vessels that were assigned to anti-piracy operations off the coast of Somalia to evacuate more than 600 Chinese citizens from Yemen. And then recently, the outbreak of civil conflict in Ethiopia forced the Chinese embassy to evacuate close to 600 of its citizens from the country. So there is greater pressure on the Chinese government to find ways to protect the large number of Chinese citizens that are working and living in these parts of the world. The Red Sea, Gulf of Aden corridor is also seen as a potential choke point that China's competitors like the US could use to cut off resources to China in the event of crisis. It's already been mentioned, I think, by Darshana, the Malacca Straits, one of the most critical areas in the South China Sea, where Chinese leaders have been preoccupied over a fear that their energy flows could be cut off. There's a narrow stretch of water, of course, between the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian island of Sumatra, and it's the main shipping channel out of the Pacific Ocean into the Indian Ocean. And some argue that this logic also applies in the Persian Gulf, which supplies nearly 30% of China's oil imports. And finally, China also plays an active role in anti-piracy efforts and UN peacekeeping in the region. As of December of last year, China had contributed about 2,500 personnel throughout 9 UN peacekeeping operation missions in Africa and the Middle East. China is the second largest contributor to UN peacekeeping operations, and it's funded 15% of the total budget, the peacekeeping operation budget in the UN, which is $6 billion. And let me end by just talking a little bit about the converging and diverging interest in all of this between the US and China. In terms of the areas of divergence, I'll mention 2 in particular. First is what I would call support for rival actors. Although China generally seeks to maintain neutrality in regional disputes in the Middle East, the U.S. oftentimes views China's strong relations with actors like Iran and Syria as contrary to U.S. interest. The second area of divergence, I think, regards norms on governance issues and human rights. And while the U.S. has a mixed track record itself when it comes to supporting democracy and human rights in the Middle East, it still considers democratic norms to be an important driver of its foreign policy. And China, on the other hand, likes to take a transactional approach to its engagement in the region, seeks to gain support from Islamic countries for policies, for example, toward Muslims at home, for example, in Xinjiang. And so this is a real area of divergence. And then lastly, I'll conclude my opening remarks and mention a few areas of convergence. The first is what we've talked about already, open sea lanes and access to resources and trade. Both countries have an interest in maintaining regional stability, in opposing terrorism, and conducting counter-piracy efforts. And then second is non-proliferation. And I think both countries were original parties to the JCPOA. Both sides continue to state they support diplomatic efforts to bring US and Iran back into compliance with the agreement. China was a part of the original JCPOA. However, I think it's fair to say it played a nominal role. It certainly made sure it had a seat at the table, and it highlighted its participation as a success of its foreign policy. But it seems to many that China's participation in things like this and the Middle East peace process is mostly an effort to get the upside from being seen as a responsible global power without really taking on much of the downside risk. Let me end there my opening comments.
Thank you, Paul, for your remarks. I thought it was very interesting to hear essentially this larger theme from our speakers so far about U.S. retrenchment in the region. And when we have our moderated discussion, one question I'd like to come back to you on is you spoke a bit about the newness for China, essentially as a global actor, its engagement with the region. I wanted to know, as we're thinking about 2022, what that might look like, how China might build that out. And you mentioned the the non-combatant evacuation operations, which is really focused on Chinese nationals, but thinking a bit beyond that in terms of what China's role might be in the region, and thinking about how in this backdrop of U.S. retrenchment, how could China position itself to ultimately displace the U.S. as a guarantor of regional security? So I'll be curious to follow up with you on that, but first, let me ask attendees to start submitting their questions for our speakers. And right now, let's turn to our group discussion. Dr. Babood, I'd like to come back to you on some of the issues you mentioned in terms of the U.S.-led international maritime security construct, the European alternative to that in the Strait of Hormuz. In this backdrop of U.S. retrenchment in the region, reducing its military footprint, as you're thinking about 2022, what do you think that will look like for the region? What are some implications of these activities?
Thank you, Nilanthi, and what a pleasure to listen to the two panelists, the two co-panelists, and their views, and I share with them their views on this topic. And thank you very much for that. Well, I think looking from 2022 beyond, obviously the situation seems to be untenable. And we are seeing that no regional country can guarantee security on its own, whether it's maritime or not. We are seeing that also even the collective countries like the GCC as a regional organization on its own cannot guarantee security. And we are seeing that there is a change, a retrenchment, however you want to call it, of US footprint in the region, while we are also seeing that, or witnessing, that China is moving in, albeit reluctantly, because I don't think it wants to get involved in any military operations in the region, as it's been mentioned. And also, we're witnessing Russia, eyeing the region. So there are regional, international powers are involved, and should not forget the Europeans as well. And local or regional countries are almost neglected in this sense. And it's not because everybody wants to neglect the regional countries, because I think because of this entrenched antagonism between regional countries, they cannot work together in a sense that they can start to build their own security and involve international powers at a certain level. And this is where the situation is so complicated. It's complicated because of regional conflicts, internal conflicts. It's also complicated because of changing international interests. The free riders, as it were, in the past, are no longer going to be free riders, as we will see, because their economic and security depends on oil and trade with this region or through this region. The idea of burden sharing hasn't really worked because there is inclusion and exclusion. And I think what we need to do is have a paradigm shift in the way that we look at security in the region. A paradigm shift that is that includes all the regional actors. It's more inclusive than what is currently exclusive. When we're building regional maritime security, we're building it against whom? We have to ask that. Where is the threat coming from? Some people will say it's mainly from Iran, and to a very large extent that is true. But why is it coming from Iran? It's because of the situation regarding the JCPOA and the conflict with the United States. Now, what we're seeing is that there is a dialogue going on in Vienna, and there may be an agreement on the JCPOA, which may change things a little bit, because I think the rest of the world wants to deal with Iran as well, and the United States seems to be committed to this dialogue. But until that agreement is signed, one can never really know what's going to happen. We are also seeing that regional powers or regional countries are trying to work together. We're seeing dialogue within the GCC state. The Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has just visited Oman and Qatar, UAE and Qatar, and he's visiting all the other members of the GCC states. I hope it is, of course, to build the GCC state as a regional organization that can create some kind of a resemblance of security between themselves. But also, we are hearing that the Iranians and the Saudis have started to talk, and they've been talking for some time. And the talks sometimes go ahead and they stop because, again, of changing regional and international politics. I think the signing of the JCPOA could add to the acceleration of this dialogue. So I believe there is some kind of a recognition in the region that we cannot have security without talking to each other or without cooperating. We should not also neglect what happened regarding the Abraham Accord and the fact that Israel is now involved in regional security. We cannot neglect that Turkey has become involved in regional security. I think if you ask me what is the best way to deal with this, I think it is to create some kind of a regional mechanism that is more inclusive and comprehensive. You cannot deal with maritime security alone from the other regional security. If there is mistrust on either side, it will impede work on the other. I think international powers do obviously, as we've heard from my co-panelists, have an interest in the region, and they should be involved. Burden sharing is, of course, very important in this sense, but they should be involved at a level where they are welcomed by all the regional countries, but not to be involved in a sense that they side on one side against the other, because that has not worked. We've seen it. We've tried that, and we've seen how it has been quite costly to all of us. So again, if we need to have some kind of security and maritime security, since we're talking about that now in the region, we need a paradigm shift on how we are going to think and how we view our security. And I think we need to look at our security from the region itself, and not necessarily from the prism of international powers. Because they have a different calculation and a different lens that they look at security from here. So it's about time for our region to start to think and learn from how other regions in the world have been able to do so and succeeded, at least in keeping peace and stability and security.
Thank you, Dr. Babood. Building on your important points, I'll next go to Darshana. Dr. Babood just mentioned how essentially there's no more free riders. That's not an option anymore. And how burden sharing has not worked yet. And there's really just this fixed antagonism between regional countries. As you're looking out at the Indo-Pacific, especially from India, for example, can you provide a perspective of where perhaps India can contribute to what is needed that is currently not being achieved in the region? Japan, Australia, and then also following up on my question to you, are there some unexpected areas where we can actually see cooperation in the coming year?
I think in terms of the cooperation between, say, China and other countries, whether it's the US, Japan, India, perhaps the best example would be the work done around piracy in the region, the Horn of Africa, where everybody has contributed in some form, probably not under the same security architecture or kind of the umbrella, because China sends its own deployments, but so does Japan and so does kind of India. So I don't think so that necessarily is a bad thing, that it needs to be only under the US umbrella or it only needs to be under the NATO umbrella, because alliances work differently for different nation countries, and I think that's fine. So I do see on on issues, non-military issues, because I agree with what Paul said and also what Dr. Babood said. I don't think so there is any inclination towards either for China or the others, a situation which might lead to a conflict or which might lead to some sort of an insecurity, because it would impact everybody equally because of the dependence on energy routes to the region. I think the priority for everyone would be to keep those waters open, safe, and secure. And I think on that, we might probably see some sort of collaboration. But I think the issue comes with, okay, if China wants to secure its routes in the region, or if it wants to provide that security, it also will have to be present in the region. That means it's going to have relationships with countries in the region. And how would others, whether it's the US, whether it's India, and others view it? For instance, I know that from an Indian view, when the first time China deployed submarines to the Indian Ocean region was in support of its anti-piracy missions to the region, which the others did not see it as a necessary asset for the task at hand, but as a way to gain more experience or interactions or deployments of, say, military assets for non-traditional security issues. And I think those are concerns that come up. So I don't think so it's so much as a question of can there be cooperation on, especially in securing the waters, but I think what implications such presence would have and how comfortable it would make other countries. And I don't think so it would make India very comfortable, because India's Indian Ocean is India's home theater. The Persian Gulf, India again has a lot of diaspora there. India has energy dependency in the region. The border dispute between India and China has definitely not helped with the mistrust or kind of the relationship between China and India and spilling. So Indian Ocean region for India was perhaps quiet zone, a zone that India could had a role to play and did not face some sort of a competition the way it perhaps sees the way China looks at it. So I think from an Indian point of view, activities in the region would always increasingly make actually India a little bit uncomfortable, depending on what those activities are. For instance, I don't think so India would say that India would be against China deploying to the region for anti-piracy missions, but what those missions are, what are the associated missions with it, what is being deployed, what are the engagements, I think those are from a maritime naval point of view. I definitely think that it would be an issue, and I don't think so it's an issue just for India. I think it would be an issue for other countries other Indo-Pacific countries as well, whether it's Japan, whether it's Australia, whether it's France, UK. The other issue from Delhi has also been, I think a lot of the policies toward the region has been reactionary. I think we are definitely moving towards, the government is definitely moving towards a approach that it's trying to figure out what role it can play in different regions and sub-regions. But the Middle East, the Gulf, especially the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea has always been very important to India, and India has maintained, and India holds very close bilateral relationship with countries in the Gulf region. And I don't see that changing regardless of what changes between US and any of those countries or any of its other maritime partners. So I think India's relationship with the Gulf countries would remain important. It would be, some of them are some are most strategic partners for India, whether it is Oman or whether it is kind of UAE, Saudi Arabia. And I think I do see more and more conversations around it, India paying more attention to it. In terms of the security architecture, regional security architecture, at a wider level, I think there's IORA, but it doesn't. I think it's too big for something like that, and it's focused more on the economic and the trade side of it. At the Navy part, the naval level, there are many conversations and collaborations that the heads of Navy hold. But I think at a security architecture, the Arabian Peninsula, I'm not sure what would come out, because and on that I would agree with what Dr. Babood was saying in terms of the regional politics there amongst countries of resident powers, and their partnerships with bigger powers or external partners would play a role there. So how that is going to work, burden sharing, and even whether the other external powers, whether it's US, India, and others, how they would see any new collaborations, I'm not sure how that's going to play out, unfortunately. It is very complicated, and I think for the first time, perhaps the security issues of continental Middle East and maritime Middle East are converging in a way that it has implications across the Indo-Pacific and has a wider sense of it, because the competition definitely is coming to sea after a very long time. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Thank you, Darshana, for your comments. We're getting many questions from attendees right now. We've only got about 15 minutes left in this exciting, robust discussion. So Paul, I'll go to you next to follow up on my question before we take the questions from attendees. Essentially, how might we expect China to position itself to ultimately displace the United States as a guarantor of regional security?
Question. I think, first of all, it's important to note that the U.S. has been the main security guarantor for the region since at least the first Gulf War in the early 90s. And it still really retains the most expansive military presence among the major powers in the region, in particular, when compared with China. The U.S. Central Command regional headquarters, of course, is in Qatar. The Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. The U.S. has military stations in the UAE, Oman, Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. China, on the other hand, has one naval base in Djibouti. It does own and operate 25 ports in the Indian Ocean, which is not insignificant. 16 in the Mediterranean, and 20 in the Middle East and North Africa. These ports could eventually become dual-use facilities, for not only commercial, but also for military purposes. Or they could potentially evolve into outright military bases if local governments would go along with that. But that will take some time. I don't expect that would happen quickly. So I think for the time being, the U.S. will remain the leading security provider in the region, given its relatively larger military presence and superior power projection capabilities. That being said, as I mentioned earlier, the U.S. administration has shown an interest in continuing this pivot to Asia. Kurt Campbell, the current Indo-Pacific coordinator at the White House, he spearheaded the pivot during the Obama administration, and the Biden administration is trying to pick up where they left off. We saw in the Global Force Posture Review, the Department of Defense's 2021 Global Force Posture Review, which was completed last week. It directs additional capabilities toward the Indo-Pacific, including to Australia and Korea. The review remains vague about U.S. enduring posture requirements in the Middle East. So if the U.S. does take significant steps to relocate assets out of the Middle East region, there will likely, I think, over time be a rebalancing of sorts where China, even Russia, would take greater steps to fill those gaps. But as I mentioned before, I do think China is fairly new to this, new to the Middle East relative to the other global players that have been in the Middle East for a while. China continues to learn more about regional dynamics through having a larger footprint, through trial and error, as I mentioned before, testing the waters. But at the end of the day, I think it's important to say Beijing really doesn't want to get into the Middle East region any deeper than it needs to. And it is still trying to figure out how deep it needs to get into the Middle East to secure its own regional interest. China is not looking to replace the U.S., for example, as the main policeman of the region. It's not capable of doing that right now anyways. But again, as the U.S. begins to shy away from the role that it has played traditionally in the Middle East, China will explore ways and to what extent it might want to step up its efforts, really with a goal of maintaining its own security and protecting its own interests.
Thank you, Paul. Those are important points. In our last 10 minutes, I'll just ask each of the panelists to briefly provide a comment on each of the questions that have been posed to you in the chat. I'll read Dr. Babood's a question that has been posed to you. Oman is key to maritime security. It would be helpful if Dr. Babood can elaborate how Sultan Haitham plans in this regard amid an unstable regional environment.
Thank you. Very important question. Of course, as you know, Oman Sea is where most of these conflicts have arisen as well, and the Strait of Hormuz is shared between Oman and Iran. Any conflict in that region, in that vicinity, obviously affects Oman in quite a substantial way, more than any other country. Oman, like other countries in the region, has also built its new vision 2040 and its transformation plan on its building of its ports and logistics. And that requires stability, safety of passages, of trade, of maritime trade, etc. Any conflict in the region can have a very dire ramification on these plans and the country. So obviously, Oman also has a maritime history as well. So obviously, there has been always a concern about stability and security in the region. And that's why Oman has always followed this balancing game between Iran and its neighbors, and also between Iran and the international world, and also trying to sort out problems and conflicts through dialogue rather than confrontation. It has been the policy of Oman previous leader Sultan Qaboos, But this policy is also being continued by Sultan Haytham, who took over since his death. And he has continued to ensure that Oman continues to be a neutral country, not to get involved in regional conflicts and quarrels and antagonism and competition, and try to sort out these conflicts through dialogue and through negotiations and diplomacy. Oman's, of course, quiet diplomacy has helped to a large extent in putting some cold water on top on some of these conflicts, and has sorted them out. And I think Sultan Haytham and his new government and new outlook is going to continue with that, but I think with a much more vigor as well. And we have seen, he's been acting quite forcibly in sense of, trying to be more visible, visiting regional countries, and has plans as well to visit. And we now have a much more reinvigorated, if you like, government that wants to ensure that it is working well with its neighbors within the GCC, but at the same time not neglecting the regional environment, and that is Iran and beyond Iran as well. We live in a region that of course has many interactable conflicts, whether it is cultural, whether it is religious, whether it is ethnic, etc. And we cannot sort these out at all by just one thing. It's or by conflict. It has to be sorted out through dialogue, through negotiations, and through accepting each other and understanding that we live in this region, and therefore it is upon us, first of all, to protect this region and cooperate between ourselves. And this idea of hegemonic competition or zero-sum game has to end. And I think Oman is pushing towards for that direction. And it seems that Oman's message is now resonating within the regional countries. And I think we're going to be seeing some new developments, positive developments in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Babood. Darshana, the next question from our audience member. Militarily, can India and China risk confronting Iran in the Persian Gulf? Could you provide a brief answer?
India or China wants, I don't think so. Either India or China wants to risk a military conflict in the region. That is something I think both countries would avoid it. Paul's talked about the newness about China and that it doesn't have the capacity to interact or engage in perhaps something along those lines. And for India, it would have any sort of conflict with Iran around those waters would have great repercussions for its diaspora in the Gulf, and there's a huge labor force that goes kind of into the region. And I don't think so India is going to risk something like that. But I also wanted to quickly just get to the first part of the question, which is, can U.S. prevent such China relations in the region? I don't think so. I don't think so it can, because I think that's taking away agencies from the regional countries around from the littorals, which would essentially, if they want to seek or if they see value in a partnership with China, I think that is going to go ahead regardless of how US feels. The problem is what kind of reactions would it generate from other countries and what that would mean for the larger parts, but which leads to the question of are there alternatives to it? But just a brief answer to both the questions.
Thank you, Darshana. And then Paul, we have two questions actually from two different audience members, both about escalation, but different focal points. So one question is about escalation within the region between Iran and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the effects for a more assertive Chinese role. And then the other question is about escalations elsewhere between the US and China and how that could impact China's behavior in the Middle East. Could you provide a brief response?
Comes to China, one of China's overriding goals in the Middle East, because they lead with economics and trade, is frankly to get along well with everyone in the region. They are not looking to pick sides in conflicts. They're not looking to become overly assertive to the point where they get pushback in the region. And so my guess is they will continue to try to stay out of difficult situations, like try to put themselves in the middle of Iran and Saudi Arabia. They try to have both good relations with both. And I think they'll continue to try to do that because they're leading with interest related to economics and trade. In terms of the U.S.-China strategic rivalry and sort of the impact in the region, it's important to note, as I mentioned, the U.S. has both convergent interests, but also obviously divergent interests in the region. They are aligned on sort of trying to maintain open lanes and free flows of trade and resources. I think, however, given what we have seen, what the U.S. has watched China do in the South China Sea over the last decade in terms of militarizing islands, encroaching on other countries' exclusive economic zones, there's not a lot of trust in the U.S. about China's intentions. And we have seen situations in the region where China is looking, for example, to build something in the UAE, and U.S. diplomats will go in and try to convince UAE leaders that that's not something that they would like to see because it impinges on U.S. security interests. And I expect that we will probably continue to see that to a certain extent. Not what we saw in the Trump administration necessarily, where the Biden team would go in and pressure countries to choose China over the United States. I don't think it's that stark, but I do think that where the U.S. is watching China do things in the region that will impinge on their security interests, they'll make it known to friends and allies in the region. And I think that, China's growing involvement in the region, does have implications for those countries in the region. As China's economic interests grow, as the reliance on energy imports continues to grow, I think its maritime presence in the Middle East will grow in tandem. And as China, as I mentioned before, begins to watch the U.S. retrenching and take a less active role, it may step up its own role in protecting its own interests. And that has implications for the region. A heightened rivalry, for example, between the U.S. and China could give local actors leverage, frankly, to play the U.S. and China off of one another to accrue more favorable benefits. But that being said, if the rivalry gets more severe, I think there may come a point where countries are beginning to feel pressured to take a clearer stand with one side or the other. And that would exacerbate tensions in the region. I don't think that we're there yet, but it is certainly something to watch out for in the future.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to the speakers today. Just in our last couple minutes, some of the things I've heard in our conversation are essentially, Paul, what you talked about, the newness of China as a global actor and in the region, but essentially this issue is not going away for countries in the region, for the United States, for countries in the wider Indo-Pacific, and China will be gradually expanding its presence. Is what I took away from this discussion. Also from Darshana, from her comments, it sounds like there is certainly that prospect for cooperative activities, such as on mutually beneficial missions, such as counter-piracy. However, India will be increasingly uncomfortable with China's presence in the region. And it's also still figuring out what its relationship with Gulf countries should be. But it is certainly the region is of primary importance to India in terms of the Arabian Sea and its location. And then finally, from Dr. Babood, essentially a call to action for a paradigm shift in the region, and with regard to extra-regional actors, that there's no more free riding that can take place. The current situation is untenable, but that burden sharing efforts until this point have really been more exclusionary on balance, and that really in the coming year, an effort to provide a more inclusive regional architecture is ultimately what is needed for the Middle Eastern waters. I'd like to thank all three speakers for really insightful comments, and this discussion was quite robust as we are right out of time. And I'd like to thank all of the attendees for their many questions, which I wish we could have gotten to all of them. Our next session is coming up in 15 minutes, so hopefully everybody can take a break and tune back in for the rest of the conference. But I thank you for your participation today, and closing out here from Washington.